Today we're looking at Aunt Clara in Of Mice and Men. She's a character that most people probably won't choose to write about because she's a minor character, but if you can slip her into an exam answer, it shows a real depth of knowledge in the novel, so it would just be really impressive to an examiner. Okay, we're going to look at a few quotes from the novel where she's referred to and work out what we could say about them. The first is George talking to Slim about why he's hanging around with Lenny and just explaining a little bit about Aunt Clara. So George says this: "I knowed his Aunt Clara. She took him when he was a baby and raised him up. When his Aunt Clara died, Lenny just come along with me out working. Got kind of used to each other after a little while." And I think we can use this to actually say a little bit about Lenny. And talk about how Lenny is very dependent on care and supervision from someone else. Because if you think about it, he goes from being under the care of Aunt Clara to being under the care of George. Lenny needs someone to look after him, is the point that we're making. And this demonstrates, I think, his vulnerability and therefore creates a lot of tension whenever we see him unsupervised. So chapter 1, if you think about it, is really about Steinbeck saying, look, Lenny's going to be okay so long as George is with him, because George needs to carry his work cards and George needs to provide him with food and George needs to tell him what to say and what not to say and so on. And so you think they'll be fine so long as George is with Lenny. And Steinbeck really sets up that sense of dependence and vulnerability, I think, in the first chapter. And the reason why he does it is so that when you then see Lenny without George, it immediately creates tension. So what Steinbeck is doing in that first novel is laying the groundwork for the tension he wants to create later. Do you see what I mean? So he's deliberately emphasizing Lenny's dependence so that when Lenny isn't with George, immediately there's that tension raised and you're thinking, oh, what's going to happen now? And of course, the two moments where we do see Lenny without George, so in chapter 4, when everyone else goes into Soledad for the evening and Lenny is there with Crooks, that's almost disastrous, isn't it? Because he almost gets into a conflict with Crooks, and there's a lot of tension there before Crooks sort of backs down and stops taunting him. And then, of course, the following chapter, in chapter 5, we then see him with Curly's wife, and of course that is disastrous. Yeah. Going back to Aunt Clara, though, it talks about Aunt Clara, took him in when he was a baby and raising him up and so on. And I think we can make a point about women here if we're thinking about women in the novel, because what we've got is an image. I mean, I know we don't, she's dead now, but she's represented as a woman fulfilling a very traditional caregiver role, isn't she? And if we look at it within the context of the way that other women are represented, here we've got a woman, confined to a kind of, an archetypal or very stereotypical role of the homemaker and the caregiver and so on. And the only other roles that women adopt within the novel are prostitutes or brothel managers, or in the case of Curly's wife, a wife trapped in a dysfunctional, potentially abusive marriage. We don't know for sure. And then what does she dream of as well? She dreams of being a Hollywood movie star, doesn't she? But even that, Curly's wife's dream is of a role where she would still really be under the control of men in a male-dominated industry in Hollywood. So all of these other roles for women, they all involve them being objectified and exploited and controlled in some way. And in terms of context, in relation to women as well, it's worth looking at the context of the 1930s in America and noting that employers would have prioritized hiring men over women, believing that men had a greater responsibility to support their families. And that women who did work were sometimes, within the context of the Great Depression, where there's very high levels of unemployment, women who did work were often seen as taking jobs away from men. And some states even passed laws restricting married women from working if their husbands had jobs. The idea was that, the jobs should be for the men, and that the women maybe therefore should be at home and looking after children and so on. But because there weren't enough jobs, what jobs there were should be for men, not for women. The 1932 Economy Act actually barred more than one family member from holding a government job. So that's the 1932 Economy Act, and it barred more than one family member from owning a government job. And therefore that disproportionately affected married women and often led to them being dismissed. And so because employment opportunities were so scarce, think about 1929, the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression, the 1930s, the Dust Bowl, and so on, all these reasons why there weren't many jobs. Women were largely expected to stay at home and to take care of children. And can you see how we can tie that in with that very traditional caregiver role that Aunt Clara seems to have when she was looking after Lenny? Okay. Okay, the next quote. Lenny sat down on the ground and hung his head dejectedly. I don't know where there is no other mouse. I remember a lady used to give 'em to me, every one she got, but that lady ain't here. George scoffed. Lady, huh? Don't even remember who that lady was. That was your own Aunt Clara. She stopped giving them to you. You always killed them. I think this emphasizes Lenny's forgetfulness, doesn't it? But also there's something odd about, Lenny's attachment to people. And I think to me, it almost suggests that, Aunt Clara seems to have become this vague figure in the past, doesn't she? And it really, to me, suggests that Lenny very much lives in the present moment and in his dreams of the future. And so George has now become his means of protection and security and companionship. Aunt Clara's in the past, and so therefore all that matters now is George. That's it. That's all he can focus on. That's the only attachment that matters, and therefore everything else in the past just becomes completely irrelevant. It shows how limited Lenny is in terms of just mentally, in terms of his memory and his relationships and what he can focus his mind on. The other thing, I suppose, is that it's talking about the mice, isn't it? And the fact that he always killed them. It's another mention of death, isn't it? So it very much emphasizes the danger that Lenny poses, and the inevitability of his impulsivity and his destructive nature, the idea that he doesn't know his own strength, and so he ends up destroying even when he doesn't mean to. The idea that will cause tragedy in the future. So Steinbeck is just using this little bit of dialogue here again to foreshadow the death and the failure that we're going to encounter later on in the novel. The next one says, George is talking to Lenny and says, your own Aunt Clara wouldn't like you running off by yourself, even if she is dead. And I think it's interesting that George uses the mention of Aunt Clara here as a threat. It's a bit like a parent saying, wait till your father gets home. It kind of emphasizes the idea of George and Lenny's relationship being like that of a father and a child. It's just like the kind of threat that a parent would give to a young child, isn't it? And then the third quote we've got on this page, this is Lenny talking to Curly's wife in chapter 5, this one. And this is where he mentions Aunt Clara. He says, and I had some too. A lady give me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She give it right to me, about this big a piece. I wish I had that velvet right now. So later Lenny does remember her name. When he's talking about velvet, he's talking about soft things to Curly's wife. And I wonder whether, is it because he's opening up to Curly's wife in this situation? He seems to relax when he's maybe talking about soft things, about rabbits, about velvet, and so on. And so he's functioning very much like a young child, is the point that I would make about this. He's deriving comfort just from the memory of a pleasant sensory experience of touching this soft velvet that his Aunt Clara used to give him. And that's why Aunt Clara comes to mind. That's why he remembers her, isn't it? Because she used to give him velvet. She used to give him something soft to touch. That's what's kind of like stuck in his memory, isn't it? And there's something about that represents him as, portrays him as very innocent and childlike and young, doesn't it? It's like a child focusing on soft things, and that's all that matters to him. So if you if you want to be valued and form some attachment with a child like that, then what you do is you give them what they need in this very sort of sensory, physical way. And that's why Aunt Clara has stuck in Lenny's mind at that point. And then finally, we've got this quote from chapter 6, which is weird, isn't it? So this is where you get these weird sort of hallucinations, or projections of what's going on in Lenny's mind. And it says this: "And then from out of Lenny's head there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bull's-eye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets. And she was starched and clean, and she stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. 'I told you and I told you,' she said. 'I told you, mind George, because he's such a nice fella and good to you, but you don't never take no care. You do bad things.'" So this is Aunt Clara talking to Lenny in Lenny's voice. When he's run away, he's gone into the brush, and because he realizes he's done something bad. So it's a very emotional, he's in a very sort of emotional state, Lenny, at this point, isn't he? And in some way, maybe Aunt Clara seems to represent his conscience. She talks in his voice, perhaps representing, his deepest fears, or a sense of shame at having failed and having let down George. So there's a real sense of fear and shame, I think, going on here. And so when Aunt Clara and then also the gigantic rabbit talk to Lenny, it's like as if we're tapping into an internal voice that would normally be hidden, isn't it? This is normally what would be going on in Lenny's head, but we're hearing it. And to me, I think that's fascinating, because it's like as if Steinbeck is revealing the extent to which Lenny is constantly driven by a sense of fear and shame. This is what's been going on in Lenny's mind the whole time. That fear and that shame. It's like as if they constantly force him to live on the edge, and maybe he's been masking his true desires and his thoughts. So all day, every day, maybe Lenny is thinking, "Oh, I mustn't say something. I can't say the wrong thing. I can't do the wrong thing. George wants me to do this. Aunt Clara wouldn't want me to do that." There's this constant sense of fear and shame underlying every action. He constantly feels, I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't say this. I can't say that. Or I must say this. Or I must do that. That's the mental state that Lenny is constantly living in. And I suppose, therefore, if we're thinking about people with learning disabilities in 1930s America, it kind of highlights, doesn't it, the idea that there's not really much understanding, that there's not really much empathy, and therefore the kind of, the tension and the stress and the constant state of anxiety that someone like Lenny must have been living in. Because if he did say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, no one would have any sympathy. No one would make any adjustments for his learning disabilities, would they? No one would think, "Oh, it's okay, Lenny just did that because," or "he's only saying that because," there's no kind of sense of anyone understanding Lenny's needs or Lenny's capacity, or the reason why Lenny behaves in a different way to the other men on the ranch. There's none of that. There's or very little of it. There's just a sense of Lenny has to toe the line and has to adhere to the rules and can't stick out, otherwise they won't get a job. Think about how George is really adamant that he doesn't want Lenny to say a word when they're talking to the boss, because there's a real sense of fear that they might not be employed if he does, and they just about get away with it, don't they, when Lenny chips in and says "strong as a bull" at one point during that conversation. But I suppose I just wanted you to think about the constant fear and shame that seems to drive Lenny at this point. And so this vision of Aunt Clara scolding Lenny at this moment, I think, shows how deeply ingrained his guilt and fear of disappointing George are. And it's interesting, I think, that unlike George, who often seems to kind of temper his anger with kindness. This hallucination, it's purely critical, isn't it? And to me, that suggests that how Lenny sees himself, that he sees himself as inherently bad and unable to change. If this is an internal voice, if this is Lenny in effect talking to himself, how sad is this in terms of how Lenny sees himself? And I suppose the final question I just wanted to ask you to think about is to think about this moment in chapter 6 where this version of Aunt Clara seems to talk to Lenny in his own voice, and think, how do you feel about this? Because it's very different from the rest of the novel, isn't it? The whole of the rest of the novel has been very realistic in lots of ways, isn't it? We've heard the sights and the sounds of the life on the ranch. We've had lots of dialogue between the men. We've seen them playing cards and playing horseshoes. We've been into the bunkhouse. We've been into the barn. We've seen this real gritty, realistic version of life on a ranch in 1930s America that was based on Steinbeck's personal experiences. Okay, and then in chapter 6, it's like there's this departure from this realism. Suddenly, we get this section that's very poetic and symbolic, and we need to make sense of, well, how can Aunt Clara and this gigantic rabbit be appearing to Lenny? What is it? What are we seeing here? Is this a hallucination? Is this some representation of what's going on psychologically in Lenny's mind? What is it that we're witnessing here? Because it's such a departure stylistically, isn't it, from the way in which Steinbeck writes the rest of the novel. And therefore, how do we feel about it? And that's for you to decide. And I think if you're writing back in the exam, to kind of say, well, I like it because, or I don't like it because, and just give a personal response there.